Seems awfully close. Do I just break that? It's fine. All right, so I'll be looking at work organisation and occupational health and safety in Australia and UK horticulture. So to begin with, the work environment has undergone significant change in recent decades, and this change is most pronounced in the growth of precarious workforce. The reliance on temporary workers and highly mobile workers is no less evident in horticulture than other industries. Horticulture is a highly competitive industry, and many producers, especially smaller operations, are struggling with shrinking profit margins. The prices received for horticultural commodities are not keeping pace with prices paid for horticultural...
Hard to hear.
Closer.
A bit closer.
Sure. Not keeping pace with prices paid for horticultural inputs. And a flexible labour market is one means of achieving cost savings. And temporary work, foreign temporary workers feature prominently through seasonal worker schemes. So a lot of the hazards in horticulture are inherent to the way the work is done. Workers live and labour in remote rural areas. They're often paid by the piece, which encourages high production with potential negative consequences for safe work practices. They're temporary and often foreign-born, which limits their ability to organise collectively. And generally, they have very little discretion over how the work is performed. Although some research suggests that seasonal work can be relatively stable and not undesirable, the majority of research into seasonal work in horticulture and agriculture paints a negative picture. I've gone too far. Okay, so the horticultural work environment is subject to the full range of OHS legislation. Provisions provide a hierarchy of overlapping and complementary responsibilities, although the activities so covered and the extent to which provisions impose supply chain obligations on organisations in respect of supplier ones is somewhat uncertain. As in many other countries in the UK, there's growing concern that supply chains are undermining existing OHS regulatory apparatuses. So the Game Masters Licensing Act was established to curb the persistent and systemic exploitative practices of game masters in horticulture, agriculture, shellfish gathering and related food processing packaging industries in the UK. Also significant, certainly in theory, are supply chain provisions in EU chemical control regulations affecting downstream users, specifically the regulation REACH. In Australia too, there have been initiatives targeting supply chains and vulnerable workers, predominantly in long-haul trucking and the clothing and textile industries. Though not pertaining to horticulture, they do suggest models which could be applied to it. Examination of the international literature consistently concludes that legal regulation backed by credible enforcement is a primary driver for organisations to initiate change to improve OHS performance. However, in horticulture and the wider land-based industries, in most countries inspection is not a priority and resources are seriously underfunded. Additionally, worker mobility limits efforts to diagnose, treat and monitor occupational ill health. So this study describes the way in which work organisation, especially temporary and itinerant work, is affecting the OHS protections for horticultural workers in Australia and the UK. So the research methodology was qualitative and largely exploratory. Australia and the UK have comparable legal frameworks and face broadly comparable dilemmas. Examination of supply chain management in the relevant food and grocery industries revealed common prevailing workplace trends, including increasing outsourcing, labour hire, casualisation and work intensification. Traditionally, local working class families provided the bulk harvest labour, but seasonal workers from foreign countries now feature prominently in Australia through the Working Holiday Maker program, and far less so the seasonal worker program. And in the UK, the primary source of labour were Bulgarians, Romanians from the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme, which ceased at the end of 2013, and then A8 countries and other European Union countries. A non-probability sampling method was used. So The field research began with invitation email to horticultural businesses, labour providers, government regulators and unions. And in-person recruitment of workers took place face-to-face at workplaces, working hostels and campsites. The dominance of employer-provided accommodation in UK horticulture impeded efforts to recruit workers in the UK, and this is reflected in the lower representation of UK workers in interviews, 18 workers in Australia compared with 7 in the UK, and in total 67 semi-structured interviews were undertaken. So the main tasks reported by workers were picking, thinning and pruning, followed by pesticide spraying in Australia and ancillary tasks such as erecting and dismantling polytunnels in the UK. Work was manual, repetitive and physically demanding. In Australia, the award-based line appeared irrelevant in practice, especially under some contracting arrangements, and similar exploitative practices were referenced anecdotally in the UK. The evidence suggested that it was workers' willingness to be available without notice to work highly flexible hours and days that were conditions conducive to exploitation. There was discrepancy in regard induction and training. So all employers articulated the content of induction, yet workers were almost unanimously unable to recall the content of any induction or training they may have received in regard to OHS. Government officials and union officials were concerned that the temporary nature of employment might be affecting employers' attitudes to induction, training and participatory activities. The critical factor seemed to be the temporary nature of employment. The reliance principally on a foreign-born workforce, though not unique to horticulture, added an interesting dimension. These workers face the same problems as local workers, including insecure work and dubious OHS conditions, but their temporary resident status meant that regulatory consequences were seen as low to nil. This is an exemplar case of workers that are viewed as suspensible. Generally, workers associated OHS risk with an immediate effect, commonly the risk of falling from a ladder. Although there's little variability in the work itself, it was always a new workplace, and because it was a new workplace, it seemed that workers didn't give attention to long-term health, but rather immediate safety issues. So there were concerns amongst government regulators and union officials that there may be potential avoidance of OHS responsibilities through subcontracting, with some suggestion that growers may believe that by engaging a labour provider they can absolve themselves of their responsibilities. Comparable size horticultural business employers' responses in this regard were diverse, which suggests that evasive attitudes are perceptible but not pervasive. Workers' responses indicated that extended supply chains can obfuscate lines of responsibility, and a range of participants, including some employers, suggested that workers' precariousness may make them fearful of reporting mistreatment. So many participants spoke of language, culture and the regulatory profile for OHS and labour relations in countries of origin as factors affecting workers' attitudes to health and safety. Although these differences create obvious OHS vulnerabilities, workers in Australia, often proficient in English and educated, did not appear more conversant or willing to speak out for their rights than workers in the UK from recently acceded EU member states. They viewed the work as short-term, and this appeared to shape their attitudes to health and safety. A range of participants, including some employers, discussed workers' limited knowledge of their entitlements to workers' compensation, and workers' responses reinforced these impressions, and subcontracting appeared to contribute to considerable ignorance and confusion. Once again, the critical factor seemed to be the temporary nature of employment, i.e. it didn't seem to matter where workers came from, as the responses of some workers from developed source countries with high OHS standards indicated. The findings contribute to growing awareness that flexible work arrangements, and in particular worker mobility, present challenges to existing workers' compensation frameworks. And there was also evidence that community clinicians may be discouraged from filing workers' compensation claims because of the time required to complete the paperwork and file the claim. So The apparently widespread problems of non-compliance with regulatory provisions are more readily understood in a context in which there are shortcomings in the inspection and enforcement of OHS standards. A common sentiment in both contexts was that the inspectors are under-resourced, and inspections are so rare that the chance of a regulatory breach being detected, let alone prosecuted, is very low. The Australian findings highlighted the role of geography in regulatory failure. State inspectors spoke of the difficulty in inspecting the geographically dispersed small owner-operator businesses, and they also spoke of the difficulty in allaying fears of inspection and government encroachment within the rural community. UK interviews revealed a presumption against proactive inspection, which the HSC reportedly views as a resource-intensive and relatively inefficient form of intervention in horticulture and the wider land-based industries. Gang masters who supply labour to UK horticulture are supposed to be regulated and licensed, but finite resourcing and limits in the gang masters licensing authorities' reach were creating problems. This includes the introduction of a discretionary approach to licence applications, which abolished the mandatory inspection of businesses upon application of a gang master's licence. Only in the UK were there provisions for supply chains and hazardous chemicals, but so far as could be determined, these were not being very vigorously enforced. So against the backdrop of reduced inspection enforcement activity and individual powerlessness, it's important to consider the role that unions play in maintaining and negotiating working conditions. Owing to the geographical dispersal, employer hostility and finite resources, union officials admitted finding it almost impossible to penetrate the industry, and workers questioned the value in paying a membership fee for short-term employment. Additionally, cleavage is based on national origin, and this was most pronounced in the UK, where you had the targeted recruitment of Bulgarians, Romanians. These cleavages can diminish worker solidarity and therefore their ability to advocate for improved OHS, which then shifts the power balance in favour of employers. All right, so some conclusions. Despite a body of research documenting work organisation and its implications for foreign-born agricultural workers, this study raises a significant question about the extent to which the vulnerability that comes from being foreign-born can be disassociated from the vulnerability of the work situation. Despite these being very different groups of workers, the findings were very similar. The critical factors seem to be the temporary nature of employment. It didn't seem to matter where workers came from, although in the UK employers could potentially optimise the fact that the workers are desperate for work and with prior experience of poorer OHS standards typically found in Eastern Europe. But in Australia too, the workers can be desperate for work and are diverse, and aspects of the structure of the work, including the requirement to work 88 days regional work to acquire eligibility to apply for a second working holiday visa, also made these works vulnerable. So placing the findings into a broader context, horticultural seasonal work is long-standing, but historically local working class families provided the bulk harvest labour and would have had knowledge of the work environment because of the recurrent seasonal pattern of the work. Today, a more volatile and vulnerable group is now being used with no realistic expectation the work will be recurrent. What else? Chemis. Oh yes, that's right. The reliance on foreign-born workforce is part of explicit work organisation and supply chains nowadays affecting a wide array of countries and industries. The evidence seemed to suggest that it's the nature of the work that's critical, although of course the outsider status of foreign workers exacerbates the vulnerability already structured into the work organisation. Regulatory inspection in agriculture and horticulture has always been under-resourced and limited, but with more intensive production systems, there's greater need for regulatory scrutiny, and the evidence suggests that existing resources do not enable this in practice. Trade unions in both countries play a very limited role in negotiating and maintaining working conditions. Overall, it seemed that the workers' precariousness affected their ability to know and access their rights. This includes low unionisation, itself arguably exacerbated by the new form of work organisation, which is reliant upon foreign workers without any community attachment. And that's it.